The UN says it's running out of money. But that's not the real tension here. This isn't just about unpaid bills. It's about whether the UN still has political backing from the powers that built it. If the world's biggest multilateral body can't pay staff or run investigations, does it lose moral authority? Or does someone actually want it weaker? The real question isn't, is the UN broke? It's, who benefits if the UN stops working? Here's what we know. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has warned that the organization faces what he calls an imminent financial collapse. In a letter sent to all 193 UN member states, he said the crisis is deepening and that the UN could run out of money as early as July. The core problem is unpaid mandatory fees, known as assessed contributions. These fund the UN's regular budget and peacekeeping missions. In 2025, only 77% of those contributions were paid. That left a record shortfall. Guterres says this crisis is different from past ones because some countries have formally announced they will not pay. He warned that the integrity of the entire UN system depends on members honoring their obligations under the UN Charter. There's also a structural issue. UN financial rules require the organization to return unspent program funds, even if those funds were never actually received. In one case, the UN says it was forced to return $227 million as part of the 2026 assessment, despite not having collected that money in the first place. The United States, the UN's largest contributor, did not pay its regular budget contribution in 2025. It also provided only about 30% of expected peacekeeping funding. The US has withdrawn from multiple UN agencies, including the World Health Organization, despite legal obligations to pay outstanding dues, according to WHO officials. Other countries, including the UK and Germany, have also announced major cuts to foreign aid. That directly affects UN agencies that depend on voluntary funding. The impact is already visible. The UN Human Rights Office says it can no longer deploy investigators to document violations. UN Women has closed maternal health clinics in Afghanistan. And the World Food Programme has reduced food rations for refugees fleeing Sudan. Those are the stated facts. Most mainstream coverage frames this as a budgeting problem. Irresponsible members. Missed payments. A cash crunch. But that framing avoids a deeper question. Is this accidental? Or is it strategic? First interpretation, financial pressure as political leverage. From this perspective, withholding funds isn't a mistake. It's a tool. Major contributors, especially the United States, have long accused the UN of being inefficient, biased, or hostile to their interests. By starving the institution financially, powerful states can force changes without formally dismantling it. This shifts power away from multilateral processes and toward bilateral deals or ad hoc coalitions, where big states have more control. Under this interpretation, the goal isn't to destroy the UN. It's to weaken its autonomy. Second interpretation, strategic disengagement from multilateralism. This view is more structural. Some governments no longer see large multilateral institutions as useful. They prefer smaller coalitions, regional blocs, or national tools that bypass UN constraints altogether. From this angle, the UN isn't collapsing. It's being left behind. Notice the pattern. Humanitarian funding continues, selectively. But core institutional funding gets cut. States still want outcomes. Food aid. Disaster response. What they don't want is political oversight, investigations, or binding institutional authority. And there's more the news script doesn't question. Why are unpaid dues treated as a financial issue instead of a breach of treaty obligations? Why were refund rules left in place despite repeated warnings? And why does the loss of investigative capacity get less attention than budget numbers? There's also a bigger silence. Who decides which UN functions are essential and which ones are expendable? That silence matters. So what does this actually change? In the short term, the UN becomes weaker operationally, but louder politically. As money dries up, the Secretary General issues stronger warnings, but with fewer tools to act. Investigations slow down. Peacekeeping missions face cuts. Humanitarian agencies ration aid instead of expanding it. Longer term, this crisis risks redefining what the UN is allowed to do. A UN that can deliver food, but can't document war crimes, is a very different institution. A UN that mediates, but can't enforce norms, becomes symbolic rather than structural. So who benefits? States accused of human rights abuses benefit from fewer investigations. Major powers gain flexibility outside multilateral constraints, and alternative governance frameworks gain space. Who loses? Smaller states that rely on multilateral protection, civilian populations in conflict zones, and the idea that international law is applied universally. This crisis doesn't just shrink budgets. It narrows what global governance even means. Several things are still unclear. Will unpaid contributions trigger formal penalties under UN rules? Or will enforcement stay political? Will financial rules actually be overhauled? Or quietly ignored until the next crisis? And does selective funding signal real reform? Or slow institutional hollowing? There are three things to watch closely. First, whether arrears lead to voting penalties. Second, whether investigative mandates are permanently scaled back. And third, whether parallel institutions start replacing UN functions. In conflict zones, the UN says it's facing collapse. The real question is whether the system is failing, or being redesigned without saying so.